Hey guys, tonight we begin with the sun-baked olive oil, slicked world of ancient Greece, a civilization known for philosophy, democracy, and statues that didn't believe in pants. But beneath the legends of Plato's Sparta and golden temples lies a much harder truth. Because while ancient Greece gave us the roots of Western civilization, it also gave its average citizen a daily struggle you'd barely survive today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to ancient Greece, where your day begins not with an alarm clock, but with the sun turning your house into a slow cooking oven. Your home is a modest one, made of sun-dried mud bricks or rough stone with small windows and no glass, just wooden shutters to keep out the goats, and maybe some breeze if the gods are feeling generous. There's no insulation, no ceiling fan, and certainly no such thing as personal space, unless you count the corner where the family goat doesn't sleep. You rise early not because you're disciplined, but because it's already too hot to stay horizontal. In the summer, the stone walls absorb heat like a sponge, and by sunrise, your little house is radiating it back into your bones. In winter, those same walls turn into a freezer, and you're basically wrapped in a sheet, hoping not to become a statue of frostbite. You probably slept on a thin mat or a straw-stuffed mattress. No pillows, just a rolled-up cloak, or maybe your arm. If you're lucky, the lice left you alone last night, but probably not. There's no running water. So your morning routine involves either walking to the public fountain or, if you're rural, hauling water from a nearby well. You carry it in clay jars, balanced on your shoulders, while silently praying you don't trip and shatter a week's worth of back pain on the ground. To get clean, you don't bathe in the morning. That's saved for the end of the day, if at all. You might splash your face, rub some olive oil on your skin, then scrape it off with a stridle, a curved metal blade. Think of it as a spa day, but without the spa of the day or any real effect. And don't even think about privacy. Your family lives in the same room. You sleep together, eat together, and argue over who tracked mud in from the street. Because the street is also your hallway, your news feed, and your trash dump. You haven't even eaten yet, and already your back hurts. You're sweating, and your tunic is sticking in places no tunic should. And this is the best part of your day. So you've survived the sweat box of a Greek bedroom. Time to fuel up right. Welcome to breakfast in ancient Greece. A meal so minimal it makes modern intermittent fasting look like gluttony. Your first bite of the day. Barley bread. Stale dense, and about as exciting as the dirt it was baked near. It's called maza, made from ground barley mixed with water, shaped into flat cakes, and left to bake either on hot stones or in the ashes of last night's fire. Think ancient granola bar, but without sweetness, texture, or joy. You might dunk it in watered-down wine, because, surprise, the water isn't always safe to drink. There's no filtration system, no boiling, no Bria pitcher in your clay pantry. So instead, everyone from kids to elders gets a cup of os mixed with water. Not for the buzz, but for survival. If you're wealthy, maybe you get a fig or two, some olives, or a smudge of goat cheese. But let's be honest, you're not wealthy. You're lucky if your bread isn't crawling with yesterday's flies and doesn't crack a tooth when you bite it. No coffee, no eggs, no fruit bowl, no honey. Unless you live near a decent beekeeper and know how to bribe them. And don't expect to sit and relax. Meals are fast. No chairs, no forks, and certainly no mindful eating. You chew, you nod, and you get back to work. Oh, and if you're a woman, you don't even eat with the men. In many households, women and children eat separately often after the males are done. So, not only is the food bad, you also get to wait your turn to be disappointed. The irony: ancient Greeks are the same people who gave us symposiums, banquets, and poetic odes to wine. But breakfast, that's not worth a line of verse. It's utilitarian dry, often literally burnt, and yet you chew through it like a champion because it's the only thing standing between you and a full day of sun labor and arguing philosophers. Bong appetite. Just try not to crack a mirror. Now that you've choked down your stale barley brick and a splash of wine water, it's time to freshen up. Or more accurately, fail to. Because in ancient Greece, hygiene wasn't so much about cleanliness as it was about ritual and oil. And soap, that's a fantasy reserved for future centuries. Your morning bath usually involves pouring cold water over your body at the public fountain or courtyard basin. Unless you're lucky enough to live near a bathhouse, which most people don't, there's no shampoo, no minty body wash, and no sponge, unless you stole one from a sponge diver in the Aeon. Instead, you turn to olive oil. Yes, oil. You rub it into your skin, not to moisturize, but to collect the dirt and sweat. Then you scrape it off using a stridle, a curved bronze blade that leaves you less greasy, but still a little questionable. Imagine slathering yourself in salad dressing and then shaving it off. That's your skincare routine. And if you think that sounds glamorous, just remember, everyone else is doing it too often in communal settings, naked loudly. Hygiene is social in ancient Greece. Privacy is not. Now let's talk teeth. There are no toothbrushes, no toothpaste. Maybe you rub your gums with crushed charcoal or rinse with vinegar if you're fancy. But mostly, you chew on a twig and hope for the best. Dental hygiene is more about divine mercy than routine care. Body odor ubiquitous. Deodorant doesn't exist, but perfumes do for those who can afford them. So you might dab a little myrrh or rose oil on your neck right before walking 5 miles in sandals through the Athenian heat. The result, a uniquely Greek blend of musk, dust, and desperation. Laundry rare. Clothes are washed by beating them against stones in the river. If you're poor, your tunic probably hasn't seen water since last festival season. In short, hygiene in ancient Greece isn't about looking or smelling good. It's about appearing moderately less revolting than yesterday. The oil and scrape method helps, but only so much when you're sweating in a tunic under a sun that's trying to kill you. So yes, ancient Greece gave us democracy, philosophy, and architecture. But a decent shower's still waiting. Now that you've scraped your way into a new day, it's time to get dressed. And spoiler alert, your ancient Greek wardrobe is minimal at best and comically impractical at worst. You've got 2 options, a chiton or a hmation, both basically oversized linen rectangles that you wrap and pin with a brooch or tie with a belt. It's not tailored, it's not fitted, and it absolutely wasn't designed with windy days in mind. One wrong breeze, and suddenly your whole philosophical outlook is on display. Forget underwear. It's not a thing. And bras don't exist. So unless you're a Spartan woman, trained to sprint and wrestle, you're just hoping your pins hold and no one notices your wardrobe shifting like a loose curtain. Now let's talk footwear. If you're lucky, you own a pair of leather sandals. If not, you're barefoot. And that means a full day of walking on sun-baked stone goat trotting dirt, and whatever the local market has squished into the roads. Imagine strolling across a skillet in July while dodging donkey dung. That's your daily commute. Of course, there's no sun protection, no hats unless you're a farmer or sailor, and no sunscreen because you live in 450 BCE. And science hasn't been invented yet. The Aeon sun. It doesn't care how philosophical you are. It will roast you. By noon, your shoulders are burned, your feet are filthy, and your linen robe has stuck to you in 4 places that defy geometry. And don't forget, public nudity isn't shocking in Greek society. You might pass men at the gymnasium, training in the buff, or even politicians delivering speeches in toes that barely hold together. Now, if you're wealthy, your tunic might be dyed, maybe a soft purple or saffron yellow. But most people wear off-white or brown because dyes are expensive and no one wants to waste good color on the guy who fixes fishnets for a living. So, you walk through your day, dressed like Korua, like a toga burrito sunburned, sweating and hoping your pin doesn't pop loose in front of the priestess. And the worst part, you're only halfway through your chores. Welcome to ancient Greece, where military service isn't a job. It's your civic duty, your social expectation, and sometimes your one-way ticket to an early grave. If you're a free male citizen, especially in Athens or Sparta, congratulations. You're automatically a soldier, whether you like it or not. By your teens, you're already training with wooden weapons and learning formations in the phalanx, that famous Greek battle strategy that involves standing shoulder to shoulder behind large shields and hoping the guy next to you doesn't trip. In Sparta, boys start military training at age 7 in the brutal AOG system, a program that turns children into warriors by essentially starving, whipping, and isolating them until only the toughest remain. In Athens, things are gentler, but still mandatory. 2 years of training in your late teens, followed by decades of being on call. You don't get to say, I'm more of a thinker. Even philosophers like Socrates fought in wars, and not with witty comebacks with actual weapons. And there's always a war. Whether it's Sparta versus Athens, Athens versus Persia, Sparta versus literally everyone, or just a neighboring polis, getting sassy about trade routes, conflict is a way of life. Peace is just the pause between 2 invasions. Armor. If you can afford it, you get a bronze helmet breastplate greaves, a round hop shield, and a spear. If you can't, well, try not to be in the front row. Leather and cloth don't stop arrows. The worst part, you supply your own gear. That's right, being a soldier is a Bob situation. Bring your own bronze. Poorer citizens either beg borrow or fight lightly armed, which is Greek for more likely to die first. And when you're not fighting, you're preparing training, cleaning weapons, arguing in the assembly about strategy, or rowing warships for hours as part of the Navy. Because yes, those triumphs don't paddle themselves. There's no veterans' health care, no pensions, no therapy. Just scars, limps, and the occasional, poorly carved gravestone praising your virtue and courage. If you think life as a man in ancient Greece sounds rough, just wait until you hear about being a woman. In most Greek city-states, especially, Athens women had fewer rights than a pile of decorative urns. You couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't own land outright, and rarely appeared in public without a male escort. In fact, if people saw you out too often, they might start whispering that you were a courtesan, or worse, a Spartan. Let's start with your daily routine. You wake up before sunrise to start the chores. You spin wool, weave cloth, grind grain, fetch water, bake bread. Manage the slaves if your household has any, and raise the children. You're the household CEO, but one without pay respect or days off. Your social life limited. You don't attend plays. You don't join the philosophical debates. You're not at the gymnasium. That's for naked men only. You're confined mostly to the gyosum, the women's quarters, and your contact with the outside world consists of glimpses through lattice work windows education. If you're lucky, you might learn to read a bit, but mostly you're trained in domestic duties. Philosophy, rhetoric, geometry. That's for the boys. Your job is to marry well, have sons, and stay invisible while doing it. Marriage happens young, often in your early teens, to a man twice your age, arranged by your father, who treats you more like a trade agreement than a person. Love is optional. Dowries are mandatory, and when you do have children, your primary value becomes your womb. Now, Sparta was the exception. Spartan women were famously more liberated. They were educated, exercised in public, and could own property. But before you envy them too much, remember, their freedom came from a state-sponsored obsession with warfare and eugenics. Your main job as a Spartan woman: give birth to strong warriors or face disgrace. And if your husband dies, you can't inherit much. You can't remarry without permission. And your options shrink faster than your social circle. You're stuck legally, socially, and often physically. So yes, the Greeks worshipped powerful goddesses: Athena, Artemis, Haia, but real women. They were expected to stay quiet, stay home, and stay out of sight. Ancient Athens is hailed as the birthplace of democracy. And yes, technically, that's true. But before you get too excited, let's be clear, you probably wouldn't qualify to participate. In fact, the majority of people living in Athens were completely excluded from the democratic process. To vote in the Athenian Ecclesia Assembly, you had to be male-born to Athenian parents, a citizen over 18. That means women foreigners, called metics, slaves, and children who made up nearly 90% of the population had no political voice whatsoever. That's not democracy for the people. That's democracy for a very specific club of sunburned men in sandals. If you met the criteria, though you didn't just vote, you were expected to participate constantly. Laws were proposed, debated, and passed in huge assemblies of thousands of citizens. There were no career politicians. Every eligible man was part legislator, part jury member, and part overconfident amateur. You could even be randomly chosen to serve in powerful positions like running the treasury or serving on a jury through a lottery system, which sounds thrilling until you remember there were no qualifications. Your fishmonger might oversee military logistics one day. Your uncle, who still believes in sea monsters, might judge a murder trial tomorrow. And if someone got too powerful, too popular, or just annoyed people the wrong way, ostracism. Once a year, citizens could write a name on a broken piece of pottery, an ostrachon, and vote to exile that person for 10 years. No trial, no defense. Just go away. You're getting too famous. And yet, despite its flaws, Athenian democracy was revolutionary. It gave ordinary men a voice. Well, some ordinary men, and laid the groundwork for future political systems. But make no mistake, it wasn't fair, and it wasn't inclusive. If you were a woman, silenced. A foreign bee, born resident, who paid taxes, silenced. A slave building, the Parthenon, definitely silenced. A philosopher who asked too many questions, possibly executed. Democracy was born in ancient Greece. But if you'd shown up expecting equal rights and inclusive politics, you'd have been escorted out of the assembly and told to bring your own ostrachon. In ancient Greece, slavery wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Even modest households had at least one slave. not because the family was wealthy, but because slavery was so deeply woven into society that it felt as normal as sandals and sunburn. The idea that someone might not own another human being practically unthinkable. Slaves weren't a specific race or ethnicity. They came from conquered lands. Thracians, Syrians, Syrians, and even fellow Greeks from the wrong city-state at the wrong time. Some were born into slavery. Others were prisoners of war. A few were kidnapped and sold. It was a thriving, brutal market, and business was always good. If you lived in Athens, your slave likely did everything. Cooked your meals, fetched your water, cleaned your home, cared for your children, carried your shopping, and stood silently during dinner. Some even handled business affairs or managed the household, while the citizen owner lounged at the symposium, sipping diluted wine and debating abstract concepts like justice. Irony level maximum. In the silver mines of Loron, slaves, including children, labored in horrifying conditions, crawling through narrow shafts in total darkness, inhaling toxic dust and dying slowly for the sake of coins and civic pride. Some slaves were educated. They taught grammar and math, served as scribes, or even managed bank accounts. But make no mistake, they were still property. They could be beaten, branded, sold, or killed on a whim and had no legal rights. The few who earned freedom, called freedmen, were never truly free. They still owed loyalty to their former masters and were barred from citizenship. No voting, no land ownership, just the hope of a slightly better tomorrow. And unlike later slave systems, there was no widespread abolitionist movement. Philosophers like Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle justified slavery as natural and necessary. According to him, some people were slaves by nature. Enlightening, isn't it? Ancient Greece gave us ethics, democracy, and philosophy, but all of it was built on the backs of people who were never allowed to speak, never allowed to vote, and never allowed to matter. And that's not a footnote. It's the foundation, feeling unwell in ancient Greece. That's unfortunate, because unless you live next door to Hippocrates himself, your healthcare plan includes some vague herbs, divine intervention, and a lot of wishful thinking. Let's start with the basics. There are no hospitals as we know them. If you're sick or injured, you stay home. Maybe a neighbor knows a thing or two about pikeses. Maybe a relative remembers a prayer to Asclepius, the god of healing. Maybe your local temple has a snake you can pet for spiritual comfort. That's about it. The most famous Greek doctors were really a mix of herbalist, philosopher, and gambler. They believed in the four humors, blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to them, illness was caused by an imbalance in these fluids. So, if you had a fever, too much blood time to drain it. Coughing, too much phlegm. Try fasting melancholy. That's black bile. Maybe take a walk or stare at the sea dramatically. Most treatments were based on trial error and garlic. You might be given crushed poppy seeds. Good luck with that. Boiled figs, or a compress made of vinegar and something someone scraped off a goat. Did it work sometimes? Did it hurt almost always? Surgery, rare, terrifying, and generally a last resort. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, even a simple cut could go septic and kill you. Tools included iron knives, bone saws, and prayers. Lots of prayers. And if you needed something amputated, hope you brought a leather strap to bite down on. Midwives handled childbirth, which was dangerous even on the best days. Mortality rates for women and infants were tragically high. One bad birth, one stuck shoulder, one breech. Baby, and that was it. If you were wealthy, you might summon a traveling physician. someone with an actual scroll, and some fancy oils. If you were poor, you relied on local knowledge, street remedies, and sheer resilience, or you simply didn't recover. But hey, at least they believed in rest, clean air, and a balanced diet. So there's that. Ancient Greek medicine gave us the Hippocratic Oath, but it also gave us treatments like drink boiled cabbage water. So yes, healthcare in ancient Greece mostly herbs hope and hang on. In ancient Greece, theater wasn't just entertainment. It was a civic duty, a religious ritual, and sometimes a full contact sport for the soul. Let's start with the good part. Theater was free for citizens, assuming you weren't a woman slave or foreigner, in which case good luck seeing anything. You'd file into an enormous open-air theater carved into a hillside like the great theater of Dionysus in Athens, shoulder to shoulder, with thousands of other sweaty citizens. And you'd be there all day. Seriously, all day. The Dionysia Festival ran from dawn until night, with back-to-back plays, tragedies, comedies, and sada plays. No intermission, no snacks, and certainly no bathroom breaks unless you counted a bush on the hillside. If you showed up late or acted out, you weren't just frowned at, you could be fined. The performances themselves wild. Tragedies were emotionally gutting. Murder, madness, war gods destroying families because of one bad decision made 3 generations ago. You didn't come to laugh, you came to weep in unison. Then came the comedies, which weren't exactly light-hearted family fare. These plays mocked politicians, philosophers, entire cities, and bodily functions with stunning precision. Imagine if Saturday Night Live and a college debate had a baby, then dressed it in a giant phallic costume and sent it on stage. Actors wore towering masks, platform shoes, and exaggerated costumes. All male, of course, even for women's roles. The chorus sang, danced, and shouted commentary like an ancient Greek version of Twitter, only louder and wearing tunics. And this wasn't passive viewing. The audience was loud. They booed, hissed, threw things, and argued mid-performance. Theater was democracy with stage lights. If the play offended you, you let them know. If it moved you, you shouted, wept, and maybe reevaluated your life. At the end of the festival, a jury voted on which playwright won. Imagine spending 3 days crying over Orestes, only to find out some bawdy comedy with a talking pig god took the prize. That's ancient Greece for you. So yes, in the theater you were never just watching. You were participating and possibly throwing olives. So you've survived your tragic all-day theater binge. Now you wander into the agora, the bustling heart of the city, and stumble right into a man wearing a cloak holding no shoes and asking strangers, "What is justice?" Welcome to philosophy. It's everywhere, and it's not optional. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, philosophy was the local sport, and the champions were names we now associate with world-changing ideas. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Back then, though, they were just eccentric men who talked a lot and made other people feel stupid. Take Socrates. The man made a career out of asking questions that led nowhere and dismantling people's confidence in their own opinions. You might be minding your own business, buying olives, or petting a stray goat, and he'd appear. Do you believe in truth? I guess. What is truth? Q. 3 hours of mental spiral and a desire to move to Sparta. He never wrote anything down. His student Plato did that, but Socrates left a lasting impression, partly because Athens eventually executed him for being too annoying. Officially, it was corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. But let's be honest, he probably just wouldn't stop asking questions during dinner. Philosophy wasn't a cozy academic hobby. It was loud, confrontational, and weirdly athletic. Debates happened in public spaces. They were spontaneous, intense, and often ended in hurt feelings or deep existential crises. No microphones, just voices, hands, and enough ego to fill the pathon. And if you thought you could just watch, think again. Philosophers loved drawing in random bystanders. You didn't walk past Plato's Academy. You were absorbed into it. You said one thing slightly wrong and suddenly became the day's example of unexamined life. Even kids weren't safe. Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great, a teenager who later conquered half the known world. Imagine your high school civics teacher handing you a globe and saying, "Go fix this." So yes, philosophy gave us logic, ethics, science, and political theory. But in ancient Greece, it also gave you a headache, a crisis of identity, and a 70% chance of being publicly humiliated by a man in sandals. So you've made it in ancient Athens. You're well-spoken, clever, politically active. People like you may be too much. That's your first mistake. Because in Athens, being too popular could get you kicked out of the city for 10 years. Not arrested, not fined, just gone. This wasn't a conspiracy or a backroom deal. It was built into the system. It was called ostracism, and it was perfectly legal, perfectly public, and perfectly terrifying. Once a year, the citizens of Athens would gather to decide whether to hold an ostracism vote. If enough people agreed, everyone wrote the name of a person they wanted exiled on a broken piece of pottery called an ostracon. If someone got 6,000 or more votes, they were banished. No trial, no explanation. Just pack your sandals and leave. You didn't have to be a criminal. In fact, most ostracized people had done nothing wrong except get too influential. Maybe you were a war hero, a persuasive speaker, or just had great hair. Whatever it was, your fellow citizens decided you were becoming a threat to democracy. And democracy voted to yeet you into temporary oblivion. And here's the twist. It wasn't permanent. Ostracism lasted 10 years, after which you could come back like nothing happened. Your property was untouched. Your citizenship remained. No grudges. Just a decade-long vacation you didn't ask for. Some famous Athenians were ostracized. Aristides, the just, was so well-liked that someone allegedly voted against him, just because they were sick of hearing how virtuous he was. Brutal. Even Themistocles, the military genius who saved Athens at the Battle of Salamis, got the boot once he got too cocky. Turns out, gratitude has an expiration date. Ostracism was meant to protect Athens from tyrants, but it often punished success. So if you were ambitious, you had to walk a fine line. Be respected, but not too respected. Popular, but not charismatic enough to worry people. Think of it like a reality show, where the prize for winning too many fans is being exiled to the countryside with your dignity and olive oil stash. Athens gave birth to democracy, but it also invented cancel culture 200 to 500 years ahead of schedule. In ancient Greece, you didn't ask if you were going to die young. You just wondered how soon and how painfully. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years, and that was if you made it past infancy, which was no small feat. Roughly 1 in 3 children didn't survive childhood thanks to disease-poor nutrition, and the fact that hygiene was, as we've discussed, more theoretical than actual. You could die from anything. A scratch that turned septic, a fever no one could explain. Childbirth, a leading cause of death for women, or something as simple as drinking the wrong cup of water. Medicine was limited, and divine intervention wasn't known for consistency. If you lived in a city, disease spread fast. Cramped quarters, open-air sewers, and communal fountains made epidemics a regular part of life. The infamous plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War wiped out a third of the city. Few cities wrote about it. Then he got it, then somehow survived. Most weren't so lucky. War constant. If you were a man, odds were you'd die holding a spear or rowing a try. Even if you weren't killed, and battle injuries often turned fatal days later. No antibiotics, no stitches, just hope and garlic compresses. And there was always the possibility of death by divine tantrum. Displease a god? Forget a sacrifice. Mock a temple statue, or speak ill of Zeus after 3 cups of wine. And you could find yourself on the wrong end of a lightning bolt plague or spontaneous goat stampede. Burial rites were important. If your family couldn't afford a proper funeral with coins for the ferryman and rituals to secure your spot in the afterlife, you might be dumped outside the city walls, unmarked and forgotten. Not only was that tragic, it was spiritually dangerous. The Greeks believed unburied souls wandered eternally caught between worlds. Death wasn't poetic, it was daily, and it didn't care about your philosophy, your beauty, or your lineage. You could be a slave, a general, or a poet, and still die from a moldy fig or an angry mosquito. The Greeks had 12 Olympians, and not a single one of them liked you. In theory, ancient Greek religion was all about harmony with the divine worshipping Zeus, Hea, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, and the rest of the Golden Crew up on Mount Olympus. In practice, it was constant spiritual damage control. These gods weren't peaceful, all-loving deities. They were divine drama queens with superpowers. Forget a sacrifice. They'd ruin your crops. Say the wrong prayer, your ship sinks. Step into the wrong grove. Snake bite, plague, famine. Take your pick. The gods didn't just demand your loyalty. They demanded perfect timing, flawless rituals, and unblinking obedience. You didn't have weekly temple visits. You had daily rituals, home altars, seasonal festivals, and civic ceremonies. Before planting crops, pray to Data going to war. Offer to Ares traveling by sea. You'd better pour out some wine to Poseidon and maybe throw in a goat just to be safe. Each god had favorites and grudges. Apollo might protect your city unless your grandfather offended him once, in which case you're cursed until further notice. Hera was the goddess of marriage, but she also specialized in making mortal women's lives miserable. If Zeus so much as looked at them, Athena rewarded wisdom and also turned people into spiders. Casual. And if the Olympians weren't enough to keep you nervous, there were nymphs, satyrs, spirits, river gods, and monsters lurking around every corner. Step on the wrong patch of sacred land, and suddenly your left leg belongs to a vengeful woodland sprite. But worst of all, you never knew why something bad happened. Was it the wrong offering? The wrong timing? Did you insult a god in a dream? Maybe it was your cousin. Maybe it was something your great-grandfather did. Doesn't matter. The gods work in mysterious and deeply personal ways. And yet, for all the terror, Greek religion was woven into every part of life, from politics to childbirth to the Olympic Games. You feared the gods, yes, but you also depended on them. Their temples were city landmarks. Their festivals were national holidays. And their myths explained everything from lightning to love. You didn't believe in gods out of faith. You believed out of survival instinct. So after everything, the sun-baked homes, the barley bread breakfasts, the sandal-blistered trees, the wars, plagues, gods, and goat-related traumas, let's ask the question plainly. Would you last a single day in ancient Greece? Honestly, no. You'd fold before lunch. The heat, the diet, the constant threat of war or divine punishment would wipe that Instagrammable toga fantasy right off your face. You're not used to hauling water before breakfast or squatting over a hole in the ground next to a temple goat. You'd miss your running water, your aspirin, and your right to complain without being exiled by pottery shard. You might love the idea of living among marble statues, brilliant philosophers, and epic poets. But guess what? Those were the 1% of ancient Greece. For everyone else, it was backbreaking labor, limited rights, and frequent funerals. Your democracy, only if you're a male citizen. Your medicine, garlic, and hope. Your gods frequently furious. Your social media. A guy yelling in the agora about justice while waving a fish. And yet, for all of that, the Greeks endured. They built temples that still stand, wrote plays we still perform, debated ideas we still wrestle with, and laid the groundwork for everything from astronomy to ethics. They didn't just survive hardship. They created civilization while sweating through it. You wouldn't last, but they did. Not because life was easy, but because they found ways to make meaning in a world full of chaos. They questioned everything, fought constantly, wrote beautifully, died young, and still somehow shaped the modern world. So no, you probably wouldn't make it past your first sunstroke goat bite or unsolicited philosophy lesson in the street. But if you did, if you adapted, endured, and listened closely, you'd find yourself standing among some of the most passionate, resilient, and brilliantly flawed people history has ever known. And they wouldn't judge you for struggling. They'd just hand you a tunic point to the amphui and say, "Good, now carry that up a hill." It began with a death and a betrayal. Prasutagus, king of the Aini tribe in what is now eastern England, had played the Roman game well. He had walked a tightrope for years, ruling as a client king under the shadow of Rome. He had wealth, autonomy, and peace, so long as he stayed useful to the empire. But when he died around 60 AD, he left behind a will that was meant to protect his people. He named the Roman emperor as co-heir, alongside his two young daughters, hoping this gesture of loyalty would secure their safety and sovereignty. He was wrong. Rome did not honor the will. Rome didn't negotiate. Rome took. Without hesitation, the Roman authorities annexed the Iceni kingdom outright. Their soldiers stormed in and claimed everything: lands, livestock, homes, and treasures. But the theft of wealth wasn't the worst offense. It was what they did next that turned a political insult into a personal hell. They flogged the queen Boudica in public, not just to humiliate her, but to send a message: you are nothing. And if that wasn't enough, they violated her daughters in front of her. This wasn't just a crackdown. It was psychological warfare, the kind meant to break a people's spirit. But it didn't break Boudica. It forged her. Rome believed it had crushed a minor tribal woman beneath its boot. What it had done was awaken a lioness, a queen who would take her pain and reshape it into vengeance, a mother whose rage would soon set cities ablaze, a woman who would remind Rome that even empires bleed. Word of the atrocity spread quickly through Britannia. Other tribes listened. They remembered their own humiliations, their own land losses, their own sons killed in Roman campaigns. Rome thought the tribes divided, scattered. But in that moment, they had one thing in common: Boudica's fury. What began with Rome violating one queen would soon end with the empire reeling in fear. They had broken a treaty, broken a family, and in doing so, broken the illusion of Roman invincibility in Britannia. This wasn't just a mistake. It was the spark that would ignite one of the most ferocious revolts Rome ever faced. If Rome expected Boudica to fade into silence, they misunderstood everything about her. Boudica wasn't born to obey. She was born to lead, described by Roman historians who rarely complimented their enemies as tall, fierce, with flaming red hair, cascading down to her waist, and a voice that sliced through crowds like a war horn. She wasn't just a queen by blood. She was a symbol. And now, she was a threat. But before she became that threat, she became something deeper. A mother with nothing left to lose. Roman brutality had tried to erase her dignity, her children's future, and her people's pride. But Boudica refused to be a victim. She understood what Rome feared most wasn't an army. It was unity, and so she began to forge it, one tribe at a time. First, the Trinantes. They had once been powerful before Rome crushed them under taxes, land seizures, and slave labor. When Boudica spoke, she didn't speak like a diplomat. She spoke like a warrior mother, scarred but unbroken. She reminded them of their ancestors, of their gods, and of the earth they no longer owned. Her pain was their pain. Her rage theirs too. Then the other tribes began to listen. The Coroltalvi, the Coronovi, even some of the Brigantes. Her cause was no longer about vengeance. It became a holy mission to cleanse Britannia of Roman arrogance. She didn't promise safety. She promised glory and death with honor if it came to that. And they followed her. Because she did not stand behind her warriors. She rode among them, spear in hand, hair loose to the wind, eyes locked on the future. She called out the names of the raped, the enslaved, the executed. She summoned gods like Andras, the Celtic war goddess, as her witness, and her warriors believed her when she said the gods would fight with them. She had no formal military training, no Roman strategy scrolls, but she had something deadlier: righteous fury, sharpened by betrayal, guided by purpose. And the land itself seemed to shift under her command. This wasn't rebellion, it was resurrection. The Queen Rome thought it had broken was now the spearhead of a movement that would soon make the empire tremble, and she was just getting started. The Roman eagle had long soared over Britannia, but now the winds beneath its wings were changing. Boudica's fury wasn't a wildfire, it was a storm building with terrifying purpose. And storms need fuel. That fuel came from the thousands of Britons who had waited years, generations, even for someone to defy the empire, someone to speak not in Latin, but in blood and iron. She gave them that voice. It started with war councils held under sacred groves and moonlit hills. Boudica didn't sit on a throne. She stood in the dirt with her people. She listened to the anger of tribal elders, to the sorrow of mothers, and to the chants of druids who saw omens in the sky. They all spoke of one truth. Rome had pushed too far. Now it was time to push back. Warriors from the Trinovantes brought spears, slings, and ancient battle chants. The Aini added cavalry swift riders with wild hair and war paint, fierce and fearless. Other tribes joined with axes, blades, and torches. Even women took up arms inspired by their queen. This wasn't just an army forming. It was a resurrection of Celtic identity. But Rome had trained legions, professional soldiers, armored, disciplined, and lethal. Boudica had to make up for that with numbers, knowledge of the land, and something Rome could never teach: hatred forged in humiliation. Soon Boudica's army swelled to tens of thousands. Farmers became warriors. Hunters became assassins. Former Roman slaves and mistreated tribal allies switched sides. These weren't soldiers who fought for pay. They fought for memory, revenge, and the right to raise children without chains. She gave a speech, her first of many. Roman historians would later record her words, albeit with their bias. But what echoes through time is clear. She vowed to win or die. There would be no surrender, no submission, no turning back. Then came the first target, Camulodunum, once a British stronghold, now a Roman colony, littered with temples, statues, and villas. The Temple of Claudia stood as an insult, a shrine to the emperor who had conquered them. To Boudica and her warriors, it was not sacred. It was a provocation, and it would be the first to fall. The tribes were no longer whispering rebellion. They were marching toward it armed with fury and led by a queen who refused to kneel. Camulodunum never stood a chance. The once proud Roman colony had become a symbol of everything Boudica's people despised. Its streets echoed not with tribal chants, but with Latin commands. Its buildings rose at top sacred ground, and towering over it all was the Temple of Claudius, a marble mockery built with forced labor, praising the emperor who had subjugated the Britons. To Rome it was a monument. To Boudica it was a target. She gave the order. What followed wasn't a siege. It was an execution. Her army descended like a tidal wave. Roman settlers, many of them, veterans who had bullied and taxed the local tribes, were caught off guard. The city had no proper walls. The few Roman soldiers stationed there were poorly prepared, expecting peace, not war. They tried to hold the temple, barricading themselves inside, believing it could endure a siege. It didn't. Within 2 days, Boudica's forces breached it. The streets ran red. They spared no one. Men, women, and children were slaughtered. Boudica's war wasn't just military. It was personal. Her warriors destroyed Roman statues, burned villas, and turned their rage onto the very symbols of occupation. The temple was set ablaze, its roof collapsing in a firestorm that lit the sky for miles. Survivors were rare, and those who did escape carried tales of horror that chilled Roman blood. The fury wasn't random. It was deliberate. These were people who had seen their homes taken, their gods mocked, their daughters sold. Now they were reclaiming what had been stolen with interest. Roman officials sent pleas for help to Governor Suetonius, who was hundreds of miles away in Wales, suppressing another rebellion. But by the time he heard of Camulodunum's fall, it was already ash and smoke, a colony destroyed, its citizens dead, and the flame of rebellion rising higher. Boudica didn't stay to celebrate. There was no time. She knew Rome would respond, and hard, so she pressed on, knowing that each victory bought her momentum. Her next destination was a city larger, richer, and even more vulnerable. Londinium. If Rome hadn't taken her seriously before they would now. Camulodunum was the beginning, but it wasn't revenge yet. Not until the empire's beating heart in Britannia felt the fire. Londinium was the jewel of Roman Britannia. Founded just 17 years earlier, it had grown into a thriving hub of trade and administration. Merchants from across the empire filled its markets. Officials conducted imperial business under tiled roofs. Wealth flowed through its streets like water. But as Boudica's army marched ever closer, that wealth turned into panic. Governor Suetonius, having rushed back from Wales with a small force, arrived just ahead of the rebellion. He looked at Londinium, crowded, sprawling, defenseless, and made a brutal decision. He abandoned it. The Roman legions stationed elsewhere were too far to help. Suetonius couldn't risk his limited troops in a city that couldn't be defended. So, he withdrew, taking with him those who could flee. He left behind the old, the sick, the stubborn, and those too slow to believe a woman-led army could bring down Rome. They would learn otherwise. Boudica's forces swept into Londinium like a thunderclap. There were no walls to scale, no gates to breach. The city was open, and she made it bleed. Her warriors tore through streets with the rage of generations. They didn't loot. They didn't occupy. They eradicated. The killing was systematic. Roman citizens were dragged from their homes. Entire families were butchered. Some were impaled. Others burned alive in temples. No quarter was given. and no Roman symbol was spared. Villas were torched. Warehouses exploded into flame. The rising smoke could be seen from miles away, curling black against the British sky. This wasn't just a slaughter. It was a statement. The message: Rome is not invincible. Contemporary Roman sources like Tacitus and Cassius Dio estimated that tens of thousands died. Some accounts say the brutality exceeded even what occurred at Camilla Dunham. To Roman minds, this was not just a rebellion, it was apocalypse. And through it all rode Boudica. She did not hide behind commanders. She led on chariot, flanked by her daughters. She watched as the empire's pride crumbled beneath her. This wasn't senseless violence. To her, it was justice for what Rome had done. To her family, her people, her land. And she wasn't finished, because ahead of her stood another Roman center, Verilium. And beyond that, Rome's full retaliation. Rome had faced rebellions before. It had fought wars across continents, but never had it seen anything quite like Boudica. She wasn't a general trained in tactics. She didn't speak Latin. She didn't wear polished armor. Yet she had burned 2 Roman cities to the ground and butchered thousands, citizens and soldiers alike. And now, as Verilium, a prosperous Romanized town northwest of Londinium, went up in flames, the empire began to panic. Word of her rampage had reached the Roman Senate. Emperor Nero himself reportedly considered withdrawing entirely from Britannia. Imagine that. An empire that spanned from the deserts of Africa to the mountains of Germania considering retreat because of one woman with a chariot and a cause. That's how much she terrified them. In truth, Boudica's power wasn't just in her army. It was in what she represented. Rome saw itself as unshakable, its cities as eternal, its rule as destiny. But here was a Celtic queen, once beaten and humiliated now, leading a revolt that had reduced entire Roman settlements to ash. Every new city she burned wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological blow. Verilium followed the same fate as Camulodunum and Londinium. It was rich Romanized and completely unfortified. Boudica's warriors slaughtered the inhabitants, destroyed temples, and leveled Roman infrastructure. Archaeological evidence today still shows a thick layer of ash beneath the modern town, a fire that raged with such intensity it left a scar in the earth. But here was the paradox. With each victory, Boudica's war machine grew heavier. Her army swelled, but supply lines thinned. Organization faltered. Drunk with success, some tribes grew careless, and Rome, known for its resilience, was regrouping. Governor Suetonius wasn't idle. He had retreated, yes, but not surrendered. He began gathering reinforcements, pulling battle-hardened legions from across the province. He sought the high ground, studied the terrain, and prepared for one decisive battle. Still, even with Roman strength rebuilding, there was one lingering fear in every soldier's heart. Could they stop her? Because Boudica wasn't just waging war. She was rewriting the story of conquest. And she was proving city after burning city that Rome could bleed and queens could strike back. The final confrontation was coming, and the empire held its breath. The fire had spread as far as it could. Now, the storm had to face steel. Governor Gaius Suetonius Pinnus had chosen his battlefield carefully. He wasn't just any Roman officer. He was a survivor. While Boudica's warriors celebrated their victories, Suetonius was calculating. He selected a narrow defile, a tight space bordered by forest and hills, where Boudica's numerical advantage would count for little. His army was small, maybe 10,000 strong, but every man was a trained killer, forged in the discipline of the legions. Boudica's force, on the other hand, was immense. Some sources claim up to 200,000 warriors marched under her banner. But they weren't soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, tribal chiefs, and freedom seekers. Inspired but undisciplined, armed with fury, but not formation. They believed numbers would crush Rome like a tide. They were wrong. As Buddha's army approached, she gave one last speech. Standing at top, her war chariot flanked by her daughters, she reminded them of their suffering, of the floggings, the rapes, the stolen lands, the burnt homes. She called upon the goddess Andre, invoked the ancestors, and vowed either victory or death. Her warriors roared in response. They believed the gods would carry them. Then the battle began. The Briton charged. They filled the field with a primal fury, but Suetonius held firm. He let them come close, packed tight in the narrow terrain. Then, with perfect timing, he unleashed the Roman counterstrike. Spears flew in tight formation, shields locked. Gladi, short Roman swords, cut deep into the confused mass. Wave after wave of Britons crashed into an iron wall, and each time they broke. Then the Romans advanced step by step, disciplined, precise, merciless. Behind the Briton wagons and families had followed the army, expecting to witness Roman defeat. Instead, they became a fatal obstacle. The warriors couldn't retreat. Panic set in. The narrow battlefield turned into a slaughter. When the dust settled, it was over. Tens of thousands of Britons lay dead. The rebellion was shattered. The empire had bent but not broken. Boudica had thrown everything at Rome, and though she lost the battle, the memory of her stand would echo louder than the clash of swords. Her final fate would remain a mystery. But her legend was already immortal. The battlefield was silent, the roar of war replaced by the moans of the dying. Boudica had lost not just a battle, but a war she had set ablaze with her own hands. The ground was soaked with the blood of her people, and the ashes of their dreams drifted into the cold Britannic air. And Boudica, she was nowhere to be found. There are no eyewitness accounts of her final breath, no clear details of her death. Roman historians offer conflicting stories. Some say she took poison, choosing death over capture. Others suggest she fell ill and died quietly in the aftermath. But what they agree on is this: she vanished. No chained queen was ever paraded through the streets of Rome. No public execution, no final humiliation. She simply disappeared like a storm that burned itself out. But in that disappearance, something extraordinary happened. She became more than a queen. She became myth. Rome, shaken and humiliated by the scale of her rebellion, tried to bury the memory, but it was too late. Boudica had become a name whispered in tribal songs and echoed in the sacred groves. To the Briton, she was not a defeated rebel. She was a martyr, a goddess of war and vengeance, a mother who had stood against the world's most powerful empire and made it bleed. Even among the Romans, there was reluctant respect. Tacitus, though Roman, to the bone painted her not as a barbarian, but as a formidable leader, wronged by the arrogance of empire. Cassius Dio wrote of her commanding presence and terrifying speeches. They feared her, yes, but they also admired her resolve. And across the centuries, Boudica refused to die. She would rise again in Victorian statues, in poems by Tennyson, in history books, in school lessons. She became a symbol of defiance, especially to women who saw in her story a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Her chariot spiked wheels tearing across time became a vehicle of resistance. And so, though her body may be lost to history, her voice never left. It rides with the wind. It screams in the fire. It echoes through every soul that has ever stood against oppression and whispered, "I will not kneel." Centuries have passed since Boudica vanished into the mists of history, but her shadow still lingers across the British Isles. You can see her name carved into monuments, hear her invoked in political speeches, and feel her presence in the stubborn spirit of a land that never truly forgot her. In London, near Westminster Bridge, a bronze statue shows her standing tall on a war chariot flanked by her daughters, eyes set on the horizon, wheels raised in defiance. Below her, traffic hums and tourists wander unaware that they walk in the echoes of her rebellion. But her legacy isn't just about statues. It's about what she represents. Budaka became more than the sum of her battles. She became an eternal question, asked of every empire, every oppressor, every ruler who forgets the power of the people. What happens when the silenced rise? She was not perfect. Her revolt was marked by bloodshed and massacres. Tens of thousands died at the hands of her warriors. But history isn't written by saints. It's carved by those who dare to resist. And resistance, by its nature, is rarely clean. Still, what makes Boudica endure is not just her war against Rome. It's the fire she lit in the human imagination. A woman who lost everything and still stood tall. A queen who refused to be defined by the empire that tried to break her. A mother who turned her grief into a sword. Modern historians continue to debate her exact role, her decisions, her motives. But ask any Briton who Boudica was, and they won't recite footnotes. They'll tell you she was the queen who made Rome bleed, the woman who united tribes that had once warred with each other, the warrior who taught the world that dignity can rise even from devastation. And in that, she becomes more than historical figure. She becomes symbol of rebellion, of courage, of the unbreakable will to be free. Because even when Rome rebuilt its cities and redrew its maps, it could not erase her. Her flame still burns in every fight against tyranny, in every voice that dares to say no, and in every soul that would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. Boudica is gone, but her legend rides forever. To the ancients, illness was never random. It wasn't just about bacteria, viruses, or rogue cells. Those explanations would come thousands of years later. In the ancient world, sickness was a symptom not of physical failure alone, but of a deeper disturbance, a disruption in balance, a fracture in the harmony between body, mind, soul, and nature. In Mesopotamia, disease was often seen as divine punishment. If someone fell ill, it was believed they had offended a god, broken a taboo, or attracted a curse. Diagnosis began not with symptoms, but with questions. What have you done? Who have you angered? Priests and healers worked together, interpreting omens, casting spells, and prescribing rituals alongside herbal treatments. In ancient China, balance took on a more systematic meaning through yin and yang and the five elements. Health was the state of equilibrium between opposing forces. Too much heat or cold, dryness or moisture would throw the body off. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine didn't just treat a cough. They asked when it started, what time of day it worsened, what emotions accompanied it. Healing was holistic. Herbs, acupuncture, and dietary changes were all tools to rebalance the inner cosmos. In Greece, the physician Hippocrates rejected the idea of gods punishing people with disease, yet he too saw health as harmony. His theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dominated Western medicine for centuries. Each humor was linked to a temperament and an element. An excess or deficiency of one would cause both physical symptoms and personality shifts. A melancholic person, for instance, was said to have too much black bile. Across cultures, one thread remained the same. Health meant wholeness, not just the absence of pain, but the presence of balance. Whether it was the Ayurvedic concept of doshas in India, or the belief in spiritual possession in African healing traditions, ancient people understood that the human being was not isolated. We were part of nature, and nature, when disturbed, pushed back. So when ancient healers laid hands on the sick, they weren't just looking for physical signs. They were listening for imbalance. And they believed that to heal someone, you had to treat the invisible forces just as carefully as the visible wounds. In the land of pyramids and pharaohs, medicine was both science and sorcery. Ancient Egyptian healers, called SWNW, were not merely physicians. They were sacred intermediaries between the body and the divine. Their medical practices were surprisingly advanced and yet deeply entwined with ritual and magic. To the Egyptians, the body could bleed, bruise, and break, but its ailments were never purely physical. The spirit, the gods, and even the afterlife played a role in every sickness. Much of what we know comes from medical texts like the Ebus Papyrus, dated around 1550 BCE. This ancient scroll contains hundreds of remedies for everything from toothaches to tumors. Egyptian doctors performed surgeries, set fractures, treated infections, and drained abscesses with copper tools sterilized by fire. They knew how to check pulses, how to observe urine and feces for diagnosis, and how to use a wide variety of herbs, many still in use today. But no treatment began without the blessing of the gods. Tom was believed to have gifted humanity the secrets of healing. Seek, the lion-headed goddess of war and plague, was both feared and prayed to. She could unleash epidemics or grant recovery. Spells were often recited over a patient as herbs were applied. Words held power. Incantations weren't empty phrases. They were medicine in sound form. One of their greatest tools was honey. It was used as an antiseptic long before bacteria were understood. Wounds were bandaged with it, sometimes combined with resin or lint. Garlic and onions were prescribed for heart health. Castor oil served as a laxative. Even moldy bread was pressed into infected wounds, a primitive antibiotic centuries ahead of its time. Egyptian doctors treated not only commoners, but also royalty. Their skills were respected across borders. Neighboring civilizations would seek out Egyptian physicians for difficult cases. They were, in a way, early specialists. Some focused on the stomach, others on the eyes, or even on spiritual afflictions. But in all their knowledge, there was no separation between the physical and the sacred. A fever might come from the Nile's mosquitoes or from an angry ghost. Healing the body meant pleasing the gods, purifying the soul, and restoring divine balance. To the ancient Egyptian, a healer's true role wasn't just to cure the illness. It was to restore cosmic order. Long before modern medicine emerged, India was already writing its own story of healing. One that viewed the human body not as a machine, but as a reflection of the cosmos. This ancient system is known as Ayurveda, a Sanskrit word meaning the science of life. Rooted in the Vedic tradition, Ayurveda is more than just a medical practice. It's a philosophy, a way of living in harmony with nature, seasons, and spirit. Central to Ada is the concept of three doshas, Vapa and Kapha. Each represents a unique combination of the five elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Vat governs movement. Peter controls transformation, like digestion, and Kapha manages structure and stability. Everyone is born with a unique balance of these doshas. Illness, according to, arises when this balance is disturbed by poor diet, stress, environment, or lifestyle. Vedic texts like the Karaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita date back over 2,000 years. These detailed manuals offer not just herbal remedies, but guidance on surgery, obstetrics, psychology, and even ethics for physicians. Karika focused on internal medicine, promoting prevention as the first line of defense. Sushruta, meanwhile, is remembered as a pioneer of surgery, describing over 300 surgical procedures and more than 120 surgical instruments, many carved from wood or metal. One of his most astonishing techniques was rhinoplasty, reconstructing a nose using a flap of skin from the patient's cheek or forehead. This wasn't cosmetic. It was often used to restore faces mutilated as punishment thousands of years before Western medicine caught up. Sushruta had already set the stage, but Ayurveda's strength lies in its holistic approach. Healing the body is inseparable from healing the mind and soul. Treatments include herbal medicine, yoga, breathing, exercises, pranayama oil, massages, abhyanga, and meditative fasting. Plants like turmeric ashwagandha, neem, and tulsi weren't just food. They were medicine purifiers and protectors of life force. An Ayurvedic healer might treat a fever not just with herbs, but by adjusting your sleep schedule, examining your emotional health, and cleansing your digestive fire or ag. Ayurveda teaches that you are not separate from nature. You are nature, and when you fall ill, it is nature's call to return to balance. In ancient China, health was never just about flesh and bone. It was about energy. The invisible vital force, called qi pronounced qi, flowed through every living being. And the key to wellness was ensuring that qi moved freely without blockage or excess. This foundational idea would shape one of the oldest continuous medical systems in the world, traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. To understand illness, ancient Chinese physicians first had to understand nature itself. They observed the rhythms of the seasons, the phases of the moon, the behavior of animals, and the turning of the cosmos. From these patterns emerged two core principles, yin and yang, and the five elements, wood fire, earth metal, and water. Yin and yang represented balance in all things. Yin was cool, dark, passive, internal. Yang was hot, bright, active, external. Every organ, emotion, and function of the body was classified under these opposing but complementary forces. Health, then, was a dynamic balance between them. A fever wasn't just a rise in temperature, it was an excess of yang. Fatigue might signal a depletion of yin. Diagnosis was an art. Physicians didn't rely on tools. They relied on the senses. They examined the tongue, felt the pulse at multiple positions, listened to the tone of the voice, and asked questions about dreams, emotions, and bowel movements. Every detail offered insight into the balance or imbalance of qi. To restore health, they turned to a vast toolkit. Acupuncture, the insertion of fine needles into precise points along the body's meridians, was used to unblock qi and restore flow. Moxibustion, the burning of the mugwort herb near these points, was used to warm and stimulate circulation. Cupping herbal formulas, qigong exercises, and strict dietary adjustments all played vital roles. The ancient text hanging, or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, compiled around 2,000 years ago, remains the foundation of TCM today. It didn't just list diseases. It explored causes, prevention, and lifestyle. It taught that emotions like anger, grief, and fear could disrupt organs, and that healing required emotional balance as well as physical remedies. Chinese medicine never separated the person from the world around them. To treat the body, one must treat the climate, the soul, and the unseen energy within. In every heartbeat, the ancients believed qi was speaking, and the healer's task was to listen. In the temples of ancient Greece and the forums of Rome, medicine began to step away from the divine and into the realm of reason. But even here, the body was still seen as a delicate ecosystem, ruled by balance and temperament. And at the center of this worldview stood a theory that would shape Western medicine for over 1,000 years. The four humors developed by the Greek physician Hippocrates and later expanded by Roman doctors like Galen. The theory proposed that the human body was governed by four fluids: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor corresponded to an element, air, water, fire, and earth, and to a specific temperament. A healthy person had these fluids in balance illness. It was simply the result of too much or too little of one. If someone was feverish and aggressive, they might have excess yellow bile, a caloric imbalance. A sluggish, pale patient could be suffering from an overload of phlegm linked to cold and moisture. Treatment therefore focused on restoring equilibrium through bloodletting, purging, special diets, and baths. But the Greeks didn't stop at fluids. They also believed in the healing power of observation and environment. The Hippocratic Oath still echoed in modern medicine, urged physicians to do no harm, to observe their patients carefully, and to treat the whole person, not just the disease. Hippocrates advised his students to consider the seasons, winds, water quality, and even the patient's mood. Healing sanctuaries, known as named after the god Asclepius, dotted the Greek landscape. These were more than hospitals, they were spiritual retreats. Patients slept in sacred dormitories hoping to receive healing dreams. Ritual purification, exercise, diet, and prayer were all part of the cure. It was a space where reason and religion walked hand in hand. In Rome, medical practice evolved further with the rise of Galen, a Greek physician who served gladiators and emperors. He performed dissections on animals to understand anatomy, wrote hundreds of medical texts, and helped standardize humorism across the empire. Though some of his ideas were flawed, Galen's influence endured for centuries. Greco-Roman medicine, for all its mystical origins, began pushing toward a new idea that the human body was a system complex, yes, but knowable, and if understood correctly, it could be brought back into harmony. Not through gods alone, but through reason, ritual, and the careful art of healing. Long before written texts and formal schools of medicine, indigenous peoples around the world were healing their communities using a deeper kind of knowledge, one passed down through stories, visions, and hands-on experience with the natural world. For these cultures, medicine wasn't a profession. It was a way of life, woven into daily rituals, seasonal rhythms, and sacred ceremonies. Among Native American tribes, healers were known as medicine men and women. But their role extended far beyond physical treatment. They were spiritual guides, storytellers, counselors, and keepers of ancestral knowledge. Illness was seen as a disruption in the person's relationship with nature, with the tribe, with the spirits, or with themselves. Healing required more than herbs. It required reconnection. Plants were central to this practice. From the Cherokee to the Lakota, each tribe held encyclopedic knowledge of the land, what root to chew for pain, what leaf to brew for fever, what bark to crush for wounds. Sage, cedar, sweetgrass, and tobacco were sacred, used in smudging rituals to cleanse body and spirit. Yet medicine was never just about the ingredient. It was also about intention, ceremony, and respect. Healers often worked in tandem with spiritual forces. They conducted sweat lodges, vision quests, and drumming circles. Illness could be caused by a breach in Taba's spiritual possession, or even soul loss, a condition where part of the individual's essence had fled due to trauma. In such cases, rituals like soul retrieval were performed, calling the spirit back through chanting, dancing, or guided trance. The same deep reverence for nature is seen in indigenous traditions across the globe. In the Amazon rainforest, shamans rely on powerful plant medicines like ayahuasca, a hallucinogenic brew used not for recreation, but for healing insight. They believe the plants themselves are teachers revealing the roots of suffering through visions. In Aboriginal Australia, bush medicine includes herbs, clays, and rituals passed down through the dream time, the ancestral era, that still guides indigenous identity. Healing here is about balance between bodyland ancestors and songlines. These systems were never written in books. They lived in the songs, dances, and landscapes of the people. To indigenous healers, modern medicine may have its machines and laboratories, but the earth has always been the first pharmacy. And healing is not about defeating disease. It's about remembering who we are. Across every ancient civilization, regardless of language, geography, or belief system, there was one constant: the conviction that healing required more than herbs and surgery. It required spirit. Whether illness was seen as divine punishment, soul imbalance, or a breach with sacred forces, ancient people believed that true healing began in the unseen world, and the doorway to that world was ritual. In Mesopotamia, long before the rise of formal medicine, people turned to exorcists and priests to battle illness. Diseases were believed to be caused by malevolent spirits or offended gods. Clay tablets revealed detailed healing rites where chants were whispered as spices were applied. Special figurines were buried beneath houses to ward off sickness. Rituals weren't separate from treatment. They were the treatment. In ancient Egypt, no physician worked without invoking the gods. Before applying honey to a wound or bandaging a limb, the healer often recited prayers to the god of wisdom or Sekhmet, goddess of healing and wrath. Illness wasn't just a physical attack. It was a cosmic imbalance. Healing meant realigning the patient with Mahat, the principle of truth, order, and harmony. In many African traditions, healers called Ngangas or Sangomas used drumming, dancing, and divination to diagnose and cure. They spoke with ancestors, summoned spirits, and often entered trance-like states to travel the spiritual realm on behalf of their patients. Herbs were important, but the unseen world was always consulted first. Even in classical Greece, ritual played a role. In the Askapa, sacred healing temples, patients underwent rituals of purification, fasting, and prayer. At night, they slept in Enkoya, dreaming beneath statues of Asclepius, the god of healing. These dreams were interpreted by temple priests to guide treatment. Ritual wasn't superstition. It was structure. It gave shape to suffering, a language to pain, and a sense that the illness had meaning. Through symbolic acts, people could transform fear into hope, isolation into connection, and chaos into control. And more than that, it reminded them that they were not alone. Even today, science studies the placebo effect, the power of belief, the healing impact of intention. The ancients didn't need the data. They already understood. Sometimes a word spoken in reverence can heal deeper than any blade, because not all wounds are visible, and not all medicine is made of matter. When we think of ancient surgery, we often imagine crude tools, trembling hands, and unbearable pain. But the truth is far more impressive and more human. Across the ancient world, surgery was practiced with surprising precision. These early healers didn't have anesthesia, x-rays, or antiseptics, but they had skill, courage, and a remarkable understanding of the body, earned through generations of observation, trial, and often brutal necessity. In India, the Sushruta Samhita, written over 2,000 years ago, detailed more than 300 surgical procedures. Its author, Sushruta, is considered the father of surgery. He described techniques for removing tumors, setting bones, repairing hernias, and even reconstructing noses, a form of plastic surgery. His tools were sharp, varied, and carefully categorized. Forceps, scalpels, probes, and needles, many made of iron or stone. Sushruta emphasized hygiene, surgical preparation, and the importance of understanding anatomy through dissection. Though this was often limited to animals, his surgical wisdom spread far beyond India, influencing both Islamic and Western practices centuries later. In ancient Egypt, surgical knowledge blended with ritual. Papyrus texts reveal procedures for stitching wounds, treating dislocated limbs, and draining abscesses. Tools like bronze knives, bone saws, and cauterizing rods have been found in tombs. They even practiced trepidation, cutting a hole in the skull to relieve pressure or treat head injuries. Amazingly, many skulls show signs of healing, meaning the patient survived. Trepidation wasn't limited to Egypt. In pre-Columbian Peru, archaeologists have discovered hundreds of trapped skulls, often from warriors wounded in battle. Some surgeries were shockingly successful. In certain regions, over 80% of patients survived based on bone regeneration. These early surgeons may have used cocoa leaves or fermented maize beer to dull pain, along with herbal antiseptics. In the Greco-Roman world, Galen advanced surgical techniques by studying injured gladiators and dissecting animals. His insights into the nervous system and vascular pathways laid foundations for later anatomy. Roman military surgeons treated wounds on the battlefield with efficiency using cautery clamps and ligatures. While the surgery was always dangerous, it was also respected. It was the domain of those brave enough to cut into life itself, hoping to draw health from pain. These weren't butchers. They were artists of the blade, and though their knowledge was incomplete, their legacy lives on every time a scalpel is raised in healing, not harm. Today, we live in a world of digital diagnostics, robotic surgeries, and genetic mapping. We can scan a body in seconds and send prescriptions across oceans with a tap. And yet, in the quiet corners of modern medicine, the whispers of the ancient world still echo. You can find Ayurveda in yoga studios, Chinese herbal formulas in pharmacy aisles, and indigenous smudging ceremonies held in hospitals to honor patients' traditions. Medical students still take a version of the Hippocratic Oath, pledging to do no harm, just as their Greco-Roman predecessors once did. In operating rooms, we use precision tools that trace their lineage back to Sushuta's iron instruments. Concepts like holistic care, preventative medicine, and mind-body connection, now cornerstones of integrative health, are rooted in the wisdom of ancient civilizations who saw healing not as a task, but as a relationship. Even modern science has come full circle. Research increasingly confirms what the ancients believed, that stress isolation and emotional trauma can weaken the immune system, disrupt sleep, and cause physical pain. Meditation, once a spiritual discipline, is now studied for its effects on brain health. Forest bathing, derived from Shinto and indigenous nature practices, is prescribed for anxiety. And the placebo effect, healing powered by belief, continues to puzzle researchers who once dismissed it. It's easy to see ancient medicine as outdated. Superstition, folklore, primitive guesswork. But when we look closer, we see something profound. A worldview that treated illness not just as a broken machine, but as a disruption in being, a signal that something somewhere was out of harmony. And that idea still matters, because medicine isn't only about treatment. It's about meaning, about comfort, about being seen and understood. The ancients knew this instinctively. Whether they used chance needles, leaves, or blades, they understood that healing was sacred. Today, as we push further into the future of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and personalized medicine, perhaps we are not leaving the ancient world behind. Perhaps we are returning to it with new tools, but the same human heart. A heart that still longs for balance, for wholeness, for healing, not just of body, but of spirit. Her name drifts through history like a half-remembered melody. Sappho, a poetess from the island of Lesbos, born sometime around 630 BCE, whose voice once stirred the hearts of listeners under starlit skies. and whose words, even in fragments, still echo with longing. Unlike the grand warriors and kings of ancient Greece, Sappho's fame came not from conquest, but from emotion. Her domain was not the battlefield, but the human soul. She wrote of love and jealousy, beauty and despair, joy and yearning. She captured the fleeting moments, a glance, a blush, a tremble, and held them in verse like pressed flowers, fragile yet eternal. Very little is known of her life. No portraits, no diaries. What we have are traces, a few lines preserved by ancient scholars, quotes embedded in other works, and the ruins of papyrus scrolls lost to time. And yet, these fragments shine. The Greek philosopher Plato called her the 10th muse. Centuries later, poets, translators, and dreamers would seek her, piecing her life together like an unfinished song. Sappho was likely born into a noble family on Lesbos, an island in the northeastern Aegean Sea. This was a place of music and learning, where poetry was woven into the fabric of social life. She may have had siblings, a daughter, and even political enemies, though the records are vague. She lived through exile and unrest, moments of silence and moments of song. Her world was one where most women's voices were confined to the home or stifled altogether. But Sappho defied silence. She stood apart, not with rebellion, but with beauty. She wrote in the Aeolic dialect in short, vivid lyrics designed to be sung to the lyre. Her style was intimate, rich with imagery. Evening star, you bring back all that the shining day has scattered. Words like these outlived empires. And then, as quietly as she appeared in the records, she faded. Much of her work is lost, burned, buried, or dismissed. But what remains proves one thing. She didn't need monuments. Her poems were her monument. And today, when we speak of passion in verse of love, without shame of longing that defies centuries, we are still whispering the name Sappho. To understand Sappho, you must first understand Lesbos, the island that cradled her voice. Lesbos was no backwater. In the ancient Greek world, it was a flourishing hub of art, music, and philosophy. With its fertile valleys, olive groves, and coastal winds, scented with salt and flowers, Lesbos was both a physical paradise and a cultural gem. It wasn't Athens. It didn't need to be. It had its own rhythm, slower, more sensual, and steeped in lyric tradition. Here, music wasn't decoration. It was devotion. The lyre and ouz echoed through homes and temples. Poetry was sung, not read. And in this world of sound and nature, Sappho's voice was born. She lived in the city of Mytilene, the island's bustling heart. Politics thrived here, and so did art. The island boasted poets and philosophers, rival factions, and shifting alliances. Sappho herself was once exiled perhaps to Sicily amid political unrest. But it was always Lesbos that drew her home. It was her muse. Lesbos was also a space of female community, rare in the ancient world. Aristocratic girls were educated in music, poetry, and ritual. Some scholars believe Sappho led a kind of theasos, a circle, or school, where young women learned the art of lyric poetry, dance, and devotion to the goddess Aphrodite. This was not formal education as we know it, but a sacred, creative sisterhood. Here bonds formed that were emotional, intellectual, and possibly romantic. Sappho wrote directly to these women, not as abstract muses, but as real presences in her life. She addressed them by name, mourned their departures, celebrated their beauty, and confessed her love with searing honesty. In one fragment she writes, "I have not had one word from her. I beg you bring her back to me." These lines don't come from myth or theater. They come from a lived world, a circle of women, singing by lamplight, weaving emotion into song. And though time would later distort her legacy, framing it with scandal or speculation, Lesbos was the soil from which her truth grew. Not just a location on a map, but a cultural cradle of passion artistry and female expression. Sappho didn't just live on Lesbos. She became Lesbos, its breath, its heart, its voice. In an age when the great epics of Homer praised gods and heroes and men, filled scrolls with battles and conquests, Sappho wrote about the heart. She didn't sing of war. She sang of a trembling hand, a shy glance, a voice that made her body shiver. She was one of the first poets in Western history to write in the first-person I, not just narrating events, but feeling them. And what she felt was love, longing, jealousy, tenderness, and desire. Most astonishing of all, she wrote as a woman to women about women. In ancient Greece, a woman's voice was often confined to the home or silenced entirely. Public life literature, politics, philosophy, these belonged to men. But Sappho stepped outside those walls, not with rebellion, but with rhythm. Her poetry did not demand space. It created its own, a private universe where emotion was not weakness, but power. And within that space, she did something radical. She named the women she loved. She didn't reduce them to symbols. She didn't speak in metaphor alone. She remembered their laughter, their perfume, the way they braided their hair. In one fragment, she describes the sensation of seeing a beloved. He is equal to the gods, that man who sits beside you, who listens to your sweet voice and watches your lovely laughter. Oh, it makes my heart beat fast. Here Sappho is the onlooker, watching the woman she adores speak to another. Her jealousy is quiet, aching, deeply human. In just a few lines, she captures the full weight of unrequited love, something every listener then or now can understand. Her words carried the erotic, but never the vulgar. She wrote of sensuality with the care of a painter, the curve of a neck, the softness of sleep, the way moonlight touched skin. She didn't separate beauty from intimacy. They were one. Because of this, later centuries often misunderstood or censored her. Some tried to erase her queerness. Others mythologized her heartbreak into tragedy. But none of that diminishes the truth of her voice. A woman who wrote honestly, lyrically, and bravely about love, not in theory, but as someone who had lived it deeply, openly, and without apology. Sappho didn't just write poetry. She composed music for the soul. Her verses were never meant for silent reading. In ancient Greece, poetry was alive. It was sound breath vibration. Sappho's form was the lyric short and intensely personal, meant to be performed with a lyre. A small, stringed instrument cradled in the lap, plucked gently, while the voice carried the words like a breeze over the sea. This was the heart of lyric poetry, and it's where the word lyrical comes from. The poetry wasn't epic. It didn't tell long tales of war and gods. It was intimate, emotional, and immediate. The lyric was a whisper, a confession, a love letter, sung beneath fig trees or in candlelit rooms. And Sappho was its undisputed master. Her poems were crafted in Aeolic Greek, a regional dialect rich in softness and rhythm. Her preferred meter, now called the Sapphic stanza, flowed with a particular beat. 3 long lines followed by a shorter, punchy one, like a sigh at the end of a longing thought. It was subtle and musical, like the rising and falling of breath during a quiet moment between lovers. She would have performed these songs surrounded by women, students, companions, maybe even priestesses. These gatherings, possibly ritual or educational in nature, were also spaces of freedom, spaces where emotion, song, and body were not fragmented, but whole. Through these performances, Sappho trained others in the art of composition, creating not just poems, but a culture. We can only imagine what it sounded like. The soft twang of strings, the clear rise of her voice, the stillness of listeners hanging on each syllable. Many of her poems open not with statements, but with questions or invocations, like the start of a conversation or a prayer. Come to me now, O golden-throned Aphrodite, and free me from hard care. These were poems that reached up to gods and inward to desire, and yet they feel surprisingly modern. You could set them to music today, and they'd still stir something raw and real. Sappho turned poetry into song, and in doing so, she reminded the world that emotion is music, that every heartache, every thrill of touch or tremble of voice deserves a melody, and hers is one still echoing centuries later. For every line of Sappho's poetry we have today, dozens, perhaps hundreds, are lost. What remains are fragments, shards of emotion, and sound phrases ripped from their original songs, drifting across time. Some are complete stanzas, others are mere whispers, a single word, a sliver of longing, a closing thought without a beginning. And yet, even these broken pieces pulse with life like embers glowing in the ash of something once brilliant. Why did so much vanish time, war, and deliberate destruction? Sappho's works were once collected into 9 volumes, organized in the famed Library of Alexandria. These were likely copied and recited throughout the classical world. But with the fall of that library, much of ancient literature was lost. Later, as Christian influence rose, many works deemed pagan or immoral were suppressed, neglected, or intentionally burned. Sappho's poetry, filled with passion, especially same-sex love, made her a target. By the medieval period, she became a ghost. Her name survived, but her voice was nearly silenced. Only through quotations by other authors, preserved in grammar's commentaries or philosophical works, did bits of her poetry escape extinction. These fragments were often cited for their style or vocabulary, not for their emotional force. Yet the feelings still bled through. Then came the peppery. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists digging in the sands of Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, uncovered thousands of scraps of ancient manuscripts, among them torn and faded lines of Sappho, bits of songs that had not been seen for over 1,000 years. More discoveries followed. In 2004, a nearly complete poem was found on a papyrus wrapped around a mummy in Germany. Each recovery felt like a resurrection, and yet so much remains missing. We read her today in echoes. What we long for is not just what she wrote, but what she might have said if history had let her speak without interruption. Still, there's something hauntingly fitting in this survival through fragments. Sappho wrote about impermanence, about fleeting moments, about beauty that slips through the fingers like sand, and so perhaps it is appropriate that her poetry arrives to us not as a monument, but as a mystery, a puzzle pieced together by lovers of language, of music of the heart. A voice once drowned in fire, still burning. Sappho's poetry was too honest to escape judgment. In her lifetime, she was admired, celebrated even as a master of lyric poetry. Plato called her the 10th muse, placing her among the divine. Yet as centuries passed and cultures shifted, her legacy became twisted, silenced, or scandalized, depending on the times. Why? Because she wrote about love, and not the kind history was comfortable remembering. Much of her poetry centers on deep affection and desire for women. She praised their beauty, mourned their absence, confessed jealousy, and celebrated their intimacy. In her world, this was not strange. In the cultural setting of Lesbos, especially among aristocratic women, close emotional and possibly romantic bonds were accepted, even honored. But later generations, especially under Roman Christian and Victorian values, struggled with this. Rather than confront her truth, they rewrote her story. Medieval scribes ignored her. Renaissance translators softened her language. Victorians labeled her a tragic romantic heartbroken, over a man even inventing the myth that she leapt to her death from a cliff over the love of a ferryman named Fionn. A tale that appears nowhere in her authentic work. This invented story served a purpose to erase her queerness, to make her pain more palatable, her desires more conventional. Some critics reduced her poetry to merely educational or platonic. Others dismissed her altogether as indecent, and yet she persisted. Even in scandal, Sappho's name survived. In the 19th century, when open discussion of same-sex love was still taboo, her legacy quietly became a coded symbol for queer identity. The words sapphic and lesbian became terms for romantic love between women, rooted directly in her name and her home. She became, without ever intending, to a figure of resistance, a poetic ancestor to those whose loves were silenced. And still today, debates echo. Who was she? A teacher, a lover, a myth, a threat. But maybe the better question is, why are we still afraid of her truth? Sappho didn't write to fit into categories. She wrote what she felt. She named beauty, confessed longing, and lived through verse. Her scandal wasn't in her actions. It was in her honesty. She dared to write desire, and for that history tried to muffle her voice, but it never could. If there was one divine presence that hovered over Sappho's life and work, it was Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible desire. To Sappho, Aphrodite wasn't just a myth. She was a muse, a confidant, even a kind of companion in the moments of passion and heartbreak. Many of Sappho's most powerful verses are not just about love. They are prayers to Aphrodite, invocations, pleas, arguments made in verse when the weight of longing became too much to bear. In her most famous surviving poem, Ode to Aphrodite, Sappho doesn't simply praise the goddess. She speaks to her directly, almost like a friend who's heard this pain before. Come to me now. If ever you have answered my voice in the past, free me from hard care. Fulfill all that my heart longs to achieve. There is no shame in this vulnerability, no fear in expressing desire. Sappho's love is never portrayed as sinful or weak. It is divine, something sacred enough to bring a goddess down from the heavens. In the ancient world, Aphrodite wasn't just about romance. She ruled over attraction, seduction, the chemistry between bodies, the ache of separation. To call on her was to recognize that love could wound just as much as it could thrill. Sappho captured that duality perfectly. She didn't idealize love. She lived inside its contradictions. She wrote of its sweetness and its sting, its beauty and its cruelty. In another poem she writes, "Love shook my soul like the wind on the mountain, troubling the oak trees." Here love isn't gentle. It's violent, elemental, something that tears through the self without asking permission. By placing Aphrodite at the center of her emotional world, Sappho elevated longing into something mythic. Her poems blurred the line between the personal and the divine, between everyday emotion and cosmic force. And in doing so, she helped build a literary legacy where love wasn't just a theme, it was a form of worship. For Sappho, Aphrodite wasn't an abstract deity. She was a mirror, a force that reflected back all the intensity, the confusion, and the beauty of the human heart. And in every line of Sappho's verse, the goddess of love listens and replies. Like her poetry, Sappho's death is a mystery wrapped in myth. No one knows exactly when she died, how old she was, or even where she spent her final years. Some say she died peacefully on Lesbos, surrounded by the sea and the songs she loved. Others, especially later, Roman poets spun tragic fables that she leapt to her death from the white cliffs of Lafata, heartbroken over an unrequited love for the handsome ferryman Fionn. But there's no historical evidence for that story. It seems more like an invention, a way for a male-dominated literary tradition to reframe her love and suffering into a heterosexual tragedy. It turned the powerful poetic voice of a woman who loved women into a victim of unreturned affection for a man. A neat ending, perhaps, but a false one. The truth is simpler and more profound. Sappho disappeared as quietly as she arrived. After her death, her work lived on for centuries. She was studied by philosophers, quoted by playwrights, and sung in performances across the ancient Greek world. Her poetry was preserved in 9 books, a treasure trove of lyric verse. For a time, her fame rivaled Homer's. But history is not kind to voices that challenge its norms. With the rise of the Roman Empire, and later the dominance of Christian moral codes, Sappho's openly emotional and sensual poems, especially those celebrating female love, fell out of favor. Her writings were no longer recopied, her volumes left to decay in libraries that would eventually burn or crumble. Some believe her works were intentionally destroyed by early church officials who saw her songs as dangerous. By the Middle Ages, her name remained, but her words were mostly gone. It would take over 1,000 years before fragments of her verses resurfaced, unearthed from Egyptian trash heaps or quoted in ancient grammars. Piece by piece, she was reborn, not through myth, but through survival. Her death may be lost to time, but her disappearance was never total. She lingered in whispers, in stolen lines, scribbled in margins, in the persistent ache of voices that refused to be forgotten. Sappho didn't need a heroic death. Her poems were already immortal, and in the gaps where her words once lived, we can still feel the shape of her spirit, yearning unfinished, but never truly gone. Sappho's life may be lost in shadows. Her verses scattered and incomplete, but her influence has never dimmed. If anything, it has only grown stronger, like a candle that flickers but refuses to go out. In every age, someone has rediscovered her. In the Renaissance, scholars pored over her fragments, marveling at her delicate command of emotion. In the Romantic era, poets like Byron and Shelley invoked her name. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as conversations around gender and identity began to reawaken, Sappho became a symbol of queer resilience, of feminine artistry, of emotional freedom. Her name lives on in language itself. Sapphic used to describe romantic love between women. Lesbian taken from the island of her birth, now a global identity. These words are not just terms. They are echoes of her life. Proof that a voice can ripple across millennia and still reshape how we understand love and expression. Artists, writers, and musicians continue to be drawn to her. Painters have imagined her at the lyre bathed in moonlight. Poets have translated her again and again, each version seeking the pulse beneath the words. Modern authors have reimagined her, reclaimed her, resurrected her in novels, songs, and plays. And through it all, one thing remains clear. Sappho speaks to something universal. It doesn't matter that her poems are broken. It doesn't matter that her biography is blurred. What matters is the emotion that burns beneath the words, the trembling joy of desire, the ache of separation, the sacredness of beauty. These are feelings we all carry. She just found a way to sing them. Perhaps that's her true immortality. Not the marble statues or the scholarly footnotes, but the way a few lines from over 2,000 years ago can still make someone pause, breathe, and feel less alone. Sappho's gift was never just poetry, it was presence. She made feeling an art. She made longing a form of truth. And in doing so, she became more than a poet. She became a mirror for anyone who has ever loved quietly deeply or in defiance of the world. And as long as human hearts break and heal through language, Sappho will remain. Not just remembered, but felt.